The wind howled like 1,000 wounded animals, sweeping across the barren landscape and cutting through the pines with a ruthless bite. Sarah Mercer had been running for hours, each step a desperate gamble with fate. Her heart thundered in her chest as the raw, unforgiving wilderness of the frontier stretched endlessly ahead, offering no shelter, no mercy. She stumbled once, her boots sinking into the deep, half-frozen mud, but there was no time to pause. The sound of hooves pounding the earth behind her was growing louder, and with it, the certainty that they were closing in. The men who chased her were merciless, a gang of bounty hunters, their faces as hard and jagged as the land itself, determined to capture her at any cost. She didn't know why they'd been sent after her, whether it was a mistake, a vendetta, or simply bad luck. All she knew was that her life was at risk, and if she didn't find cover soon, she'd be lost. She scanned the trees, desperate for a sign, a hint of hope. There was nothing but cold, empty space. No houses, no settlements, just the lonely whisper of the wind against the tall pines. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but the terror that gripped her heart propelled her forward. Her fingers, numb from the chill, tightened around the rough leather reins of the horse she had stolen. It was only a matter of time before the beast grew too tired to carry her further, but she couldn't afford to think about that now. A sharp, piercing cry cut through the air behind her, and she knew they had spotted her. They were getting closer. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale clouding in the frigid air as the hooves drew nearer. Panic rose in her chest, tight and suffocating. She could hear their shouts now, harsh, grating voices carried on the wind. "Don't let her get away," one of the men shouted, his words barely audible over the rushing wind. "She's worth a damn fortune." She urged the horse onward, praying it could outrun the riders, but deep down, she knew it was a hopeless dream. The horse was already slowing, its sides heaving with the effort. There was no escape. Not anymore. A flicker of movement caught her eye. A dark shape, standing like a sentinel against the storm, loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged against the pale sky. A cabin in the middle of nowhere. Hope surged in Sarah's chest, too quickly, too sharply, and she forced herself to focus. She guided the horse toward the cabin, praying that whoever lived there would take pity on her. She arrived just as the horse faltered, its legs shaking beneath it. She jumped off the animal without hesitation, stumbling toward the door. Her hand slammed against the rough wood, frantic and pleading. No answer. The cold gnawed at her skin as she pounded again, her breath coming in jagged, frantic gasps. The hooves were closer now. She could hear them, feel them like a drumbeat in her chest. Desperation set in. She didn't care who lived here. She didn't care if they were a hermit or a murderer. She had no choice. The door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the shadowed interior of the cabin. His features were hidden in the gloom, but the outline of his tall frame and the worn edges of his clothing were enough to tell her he was no settler, no farmer. His face, rough and weathered from years of exposure, remained unreadable as he regarded her with cautious eyes. "Please," she gasped, her voice raw with exhaustion. "Please let me in." For a moment, he didn't move. The storm howled outside, sending a flurry of snow swirling into the cabin, but his eyes never left her face. His hand rested on the doorframe, but he made no move to open it wider. "What's going on out there?" he asked, his voice low, steady. "They're coming for me," she said, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Please, I can't outrun them. I'll die out there. Let me in, please." He didn't speak for a long time. She saw his eyes flicker toward the horizon, where the sounds of hooves and shouting could still be heard in the distance, the echo of her pursuer's approach growing louder. "Who are they?" he asked, his tone hardening slightly. "Bounty hunters," she managed to say between gasps. "They're after me." The man's gaze softened, just for a moment, before hardening again. Without another word, he stepped aside and motioned for her to enter. The warmth of the cabin hit her like a physical force. She stumbled over the threshold, her limbs shaking with fatigue. The door shut behind her with a heavy thud, cutting off the sound of the storm. She leaned against the rough-hewn wall, trying to catch her breath, her heart still pounding in her chest. "Sit," the man said, gesturing to a worn wooden chair near the hearth. His voice was calm, yet there was an authority in it that made her obey without question. She sank into the chair, her muscles trembling as the adrenaline began to ebb. The man didn't move immediately. Instead, he walked to a small table by the window, his steps slow and deliberate. Sarah could hear him rummaging through something, a cabinet perhaps. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the sparse, utilitarian furnishings. A bed in the far corner, a stove, a small table, and shelves stocked with various supplies. It was a place made for survival, not comfort. She had no idea who this man was, and yet something in his presence, something in the way he handled himself, suggested he was no stranger to danger. No stranger to solitude, either. He returned to the fire, where a kettle hung over the flames. The crackling of the fire and the hiss of the kettle filled the silence, but Sarah couldn't relax. She had been taught her whole life to be cautious, never trust anyone in the wild, especially not a man who looked like he had seen the wrong side of a dozen gunfights. But right now, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Where can I go?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "They'll find me." The man glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing her words. He didn't answer immediately, but instead poured 2 mugs of something hot and placed one before her. The warmth from the drink seeped into her frozen hands, and she took a long sip without thinking. It was whiskey, strong and biting, but it helped. Her limbs felt less like lead, and her head cleared a little. "Can't stay here long," he said finally, his voice still flat. "They'll be looking for you, and they'll find you, eventually." She met his gaze, her desperation once again rising in her chest. "Then what am I supposed to do?" The man exhaled slowly, staring into the fire as if searching for an answer. "I'll deal with them." The words were simple, but they held weight. Sarah had known men like him, men who didn't speak much, men whose actions were their words. There was no hint of doubt in his voice, no hesitation. He had made up his mind, and something deep inside her told her she would have to trust him, even if it was the last thing she wanted to do. The sound of hooves reached them then, drawing closer, the riders' voices drifting on the wind. "They're almost here," she said, panic rising again. "You can't take them all on alone." The man's lips tightened, his jaw clenching. "I don't intend to take them on. Just keep your head down and stay quiet." Sarah didn't argue. She couldn't. The man's command was calm, but the danger in his words was unmistakable. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with tension. Seconds passed, each one dragging like an eternity. The man moved toward the door, his movements deliberate, confident. Sarah stood, her heart racing, her every instinct telling her to flee, to run. But the storm outside was unforgiving, and the man had given her no choice. She swallowed hard and took another drink from the mug, the warmth fighting back the chill that had settled deep in her bones. And then, as the sounds of the riders grew deafeningly close, the man opened the door, just a crack, peering out into the wild landscape. "I'll handle this," he said quietly. "Stay hidden." Before Sarah could reply, he stepped into the storm, and the door slammed shut behind him. Seconds later, the first shout came, echoing through the trees. The bounty hunters were upon them. She crouched low in the corner, her body tense, her breath shallow. Her heart hammered in her chest as she waited, praying that the man could do what he'd promised. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, slanting shadows over the dry, cracked earth. Sarah's legs ached from the long ride, and her throat was raw from days of dust and silence. The man, her reluctant protector, rode silently beside her, his dark figure cutting through the golden haze of the setting sun. She barely knew him, yet in the span of 2 days, he had become her only chance at survival. The bounty hunters had been relentless, their pursuit never easing. The man had dealt with them as promised, dispatching 2 of them with frightening efficiency before the rest had scattered. But now, as they rode deeper into the wilderness. Sarah knew the danger was far from over. There were more hunters, more men willing to collect the price on her head, and the man beside her wasn't the type to run from a fight. "You said we were headed toward the mountains," Sarah said, her voice low but sharp. The wind had kicked up again, biting at her face, but she didn't care. She needed to understand where they were going. "But we're nowhere near them." The man didn't reply immediately. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his posture tense. He had yet to tell her his name, and she hadn't asked. What difference did it make? But now, the silence between them felt heavy, a constant reminder of their unspoken bond. She knew that she had no choice but to follow him, but it wasn't just fear that kept her silent. It was something else. Something about him made her uneasy, made her question what exactly he wanted from her. "They'll find us," he said finally, his voice cold as the wind. "I know a place. Safe for now, but it's temporary. We won't be able to stay long." She frowned, her mind working over his words. "And after that?" He glanced at her, his jaw tightening, but didn't answer. There was no need. She knew what that meant. No matter where they went, they would always be hunted. He had saved her life, but for what? Was it just a temporary truce? Or was there more to this alliance than survival? The uneasy silence stretched on until the next morning when they reached the edge of a small, abandoned settlement. The weathered buildings sat like forgotten ghosts under the oppressive sun, the dust clinging to every surface. The place seemed dead, no life, no sound except the wind scraping across the wooden structures. "We'll stay here for the night," the man said, dismounting from his horse. He tied the animal to a post and turned to her. "You can rest, but stay inside. Don't let anyone see you." Sarah nodded, but a chill crept down her spine as she followed him into one of the cabins. The interior was as barren as the outside. A single cot covered in faded blankets, a stove in the corner, and a table with a few scattered items. It was sparse, and the solitude was deafening. She was about to speak when a loud knock on the door made her jump. Her heart raced as the man's eyes flicked toward her, his face unreadable. He strode to the door and opened it just a crack, peering outside. A low conversation passed between him and the man standing in the doorway, but Sarah couldn't make out the words. The only thing she could hear clearly was the faint sound of other horses approaching. The man stepped back inside and shut the door with a heavy thud. "They're here," he said flatly, his expression unreadable. "I didn't expect it to be so soon." "Who?" Sarah's voice was trembling, her hands gripping the worn fabric of her dress. "What do you mean? Who's here?" "Trouble," he muttered, his eyes darkening. "I'll take care of it. You stay put." He was gone before she could protest, slipping out into the growing darkness like a shadow. Sarah stood there, frozen, fear creeping up her spine. She paced the small room, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, of what might happen if the man failed to return. Minutes passed, then an hour. The silence outside pressed in, suffocating and oppressive. She couldn't take it any longer. She had to know what was happening. Sarah crept to the door and cracked it open, just enough to peer out. The man was standing in front of the cabin, his back to her, speaking to two men, bounty hunters, no doubt, whose horses were tied to the post by the road. The flicker of torchlight reflected off their worn faces, and Sarah's stomach dropped when she saw the second figure. A woman. Her pulse quickened. The woman was dressed in plain, sturdy clothing, her dark eyes scanning the cabin with the intensity of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. A thin scar ran down the side of her cheek, a reminder that life on the frontier didn't allow for softness. The man turned away from them, his stance rigid, and the conversation seemed to end. He walked back into the cabin, his face drawn and tense. When he saw Sarah at the door, his gaze darkened. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice cold. "But, no, stay inside." She flinched at the sharpness in his tone, but nodded, retreating back into the shadows of the cabin. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, but she couldn't stop herself from watching through the small crack in the door. The man stepped toward the two bounty hunters, who were now dismounting, and a quiet exchange took place. Sarah couldn't hear what was said, but she saw the flicker of tension between them. The hunters weren't just here for her. They had a proposal. Her stomach churned with dread. When the men turned to leave, the woman with the scar stayed behind, stepping forward with a sense of purpose. Sarah's eyes widened in shock as the woman's gaze landed on her, sharp as a knife. The woman's lips curled into a thin smile, and she approached the door. "I'm sorry to trouble you," the woman said, her voice smooth and cold. "But it seems there's been a change of plans." The man stepped between Sarah and the door, his posture rigid, as though he were trying to shield her from something far worse than the bounty hunters themselves. "You're not taking her," the man said, his voice quiet but dangerous. The woman let out a low laugh, shaking her head as if she were amused by his defiance. "I'm not here to take her. I'm here to make sure the deal is followed through." Her eyes flicked to Sarah, and her smile turned predatory. "Your bride-to-be. A marriage agreement." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? I didn't agree to any marriage." The woman's gaze flickered to the man, who stood silent, his jaw set. The tension in the room grew thick enough to choke on. "It wasn't your choice," the woman said, her voice carrying an unspoken threat. "You've been marked, and now you belong to him." The man's face didn't change, but Sarah saw the flicker of something darker in his eyes. He turned to her, his expression cold and unreadable. "It's the only way," he said flatly, "if you want to live." The woman stepped closer, her presence imposing, and a chill ran down Sarah's spine. "The marriage is the only way to seal the deal. They won't stop hunting you otherwise. You'll be his wife, whether you like it or not." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as the room seemed to close in around her. Her heart hammered in her chest, her hands shaking as she took a step back. She wouldn't, but in that moment she understood. There was no escape. There never had been. She was trapped in a web of her own making, bound by the rules of a land where survival was the only thing that mattered. As the woman left, Sarah turned to the man, her eyes full of unspoken questions. His face remained unreadable, a mask of stoic determination. He hadn't asked for this, but he had made the choice to protect her, to keep her alive. But what cost? The door slammed shut behind him, and Sarah was left alone, the weight of the decision settling over her like a cold, suffocating blanket. She had no choice but to accept this forced marriage. But the question lingered in her mind like a shadow. Would it be the end of her, or the beginning of something far darker? The morning after the confrontation had come too quickly, a cold light creeping through the cracked window, as if the world were indifferent to Sarah's turmoil. She woke in the small, stark bed, her limbs stiff from the cramped space, her mind tangled with thoughts of betrayal and survival. The man had kept his word, protecting her from the bounty hunters, only to force her into a marriage she never wanted. Her fingers traced the rough edges of the thin blanket, the weight of the previous night's conversation still heavy on her chest. She had been marked, tied to him by the grim reality of the frontier. The man, silent and distant as always, had not said much since the woman with the scar left. Yet she knew this was his way, pragmatic, decisive, but cold. There was no comfort to be found in him. As the hours passed, Sarah remained in the cabin, though her thoughts churned with restless energy. She needed to understand. Why had he done it? Why had he agreed to this forced marriage? Was it for his own benefit, or was there something more to it? The door creaked open, and the man stepped in, his silhouette outlined against the growing light outside. His gaze flicked toward her, and for a moment their eyes locked. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, an invisible boundary neither of them knew how to cross. "I've arranged for us to leave," he said, his voice steady but devoid of warmth. "We'll head west, toward the mountains. It's the only way to get out of their reach." Sarah stood abruptly, her heart thudding in her chest. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the swell of emotions rising with the surge of anger. "You think that's enough?" she demanded, her voice sharp, the words bitter on her tongue. "You think this marriage, this arranged life will make everything go away?" His eyes narrowed, but he didn't move toward her. He seemed to be waiting, as if she were a problem to be solved, not a person to be understood. "It's the only choice. If you want to live, this is it." Her fists clenched at her sides, frustration and confusion twisting inside her. "What about you?" she snapped. "Why are you doing this? You don't have to protect me. You don't owe me anything." For the first time since they met, the man's features softened, just slightly, but enough for Sarah to catch the flicker of something deeper in his eyes. "I don't owe you anything," he said quietly, his voice low and rough. "But I've made a choice, and that choice is to keep you alive. You think I want this? You think I want to be tied to you by a piece of paper or some bastard's word? No, I don't. But it's the only way to ensure they don't come after us both." The silence between them deepened, as Sarah searched his face for any hint of emotion beyond the stoic mask he wore. There was a hardness in him, something that told her his past had been filled with decisions like this. Choices made out of necessity, not desire. "You think I don't understand that?" she said, her voice quieter now, almost trembling. "You think I haven't seen what this life does to people? I've watched it, lived it, seen it tear families apart. You don't have to chain me to you like this. You could have left me to die, and you didn't. But you've done something worse. You've given me no choice." The man took a step closer, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "You've always had a choice," he said, his voice no longer cold, but something more raw, something almost fragile. "But you didn't want to die out there. I didn't want to be the man to make you live this way, but it's the only way." Sarah's heart ached with the weight of his words, the admission he hadn't intended to make. His actions, his coldness, they weren't born from malice, but from a man who had learned the cost of survival in a brutal world. He had chosen her, not out of pity, but because in this wasteland of blood and dust, she had become something worth saving. There was a long pause, one that stretched out between them, filled with the weight of everything unspoken. "And what now?" Sarah asked, her voice small, almost resigned. "What happens when we reach the mountains? Do we just keep running forever?" He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, his face softened just enough for her to see the faintest trace of vulnerability, a flicker, like the last embers of a fire, struggling to stay alight. "We stop running," he said simply. "We make a stand. You and I, together." The words sank in, and for the first time since they had met, Sarah saw the man for who he truly was. He wasn't just some faceless wanderer trying to survive. He was someone who, against all odds, was willing to fight for something other than his own skin. She didn't know if it was her or the idea of redemption that had driven him, but in that moment, she realized she had a choice too. She didn't have to accept the life he'd forced on her. She could take it, fight for it, make it her own. The sound of distant voices reached them, harsh and grating. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and the man's head snapped toward the door. Without a word, he moved swiftly toward the window, his movements deliberate and practiced. Sarah followed, her heart pounding in her chest. "They're here," he murmured. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something in his gaze, something that was more than cold calculation. There was determination, and perhaps something else she couldn't name. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and insistent. The man turned, his expression hardening. "Stay inside," he ordered. She didn't argue. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about more than the contract that bound them. It was about taking the reins of her own fate. The man opened the door, his figure blocking Sarah from view. The voices outside became clearer, and she could hear the gruff tones of men calling his name, demanding entry. "Where is she?" A voice barked from beyond the threshold. "The girl. Where is she hiding?" The man's voice was quiet, but firm. "She's not here." A tense silence followed. Sarah's hands trembled, but she steeled herself, pressing her back to the wall, her breath shallow. "You're lying," the voice on the other side of the door growled. "We know she's with you." There was a long pause before the man spoke again. "She's gone. You've lost her." The tension was thick, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. It was only a matter of time before the lie would be discovered, but she had no other choice. She could only trust that the man would keep his word, that he would protect her until they could escape. There was a shuffle of boots, then the sound of footsteps retreating. The voices faded, and the door clicked shut once again. The man turned to Sarah, his face taut with the strain of the moment. He didn't say anything at first, but his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "This is who we are. This is the world we live in. And if we're going to survive it, we have to fight together. No more running." Sarah stood still, her gaze locked on his. The air between them was thick with the weight of what had just happened, the lie, the threat, but also with something else, something unspoken. It was a bridge, a crack in the wall they had both built around themselves. She could feel it now, the faint stirrings of something more than survival, something worth fighting for. "I understand," she said softly, her voice steady. "And I'll fight, not just for me, but for us." The man nodded, a brief flicker of approval in his eyes. And for the first time, the silence between them wasn't a barrier. It was a beginning. The world outside might have been unforgiving, but in that moment, inside the cabin with the man she had once feared, Sarah felt something stir deep within her, a sense of hope that had long been buried, now rising like a tide. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would do it as more than just strangers bound by a forced marriage. They would fight, not just for their lives, but for the possibility of redemption.